Welcome back. It's Intro to Physical Anthropology. I am your instructor, David Leitner. And today we are going to start our unit on DNA. And I want to start off by explaining why we are doing it this way. For the next sort of several chapters in the book, we're really going to be trying to understand the mechanisms of evolution from the ground up. And so we're starting at the smallest scale right now, the molecular scale with DNA, and we're going to build our way up. That's important because, in fact, there are implications of the structure and function of DNA that directly impact how evolution occurs. Okay, so this is an important element in understanding the patterns that we're going to see in evolution later. So, to start with, though, I want to talk a little bit about genetic metaphors, okay? Metaphors and models are a key part of not just understanding science, but communicating it as well, and we do this a lot. But there are some important things to remember about metaphors and models, is that they're rarely perfect, okay? So there are always some shortcomings, and so you run the risk when you use a particular metaphor to explain something complex like DNA that it oversimplifies it. Okay, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about that before we get into other things, because we're going to be using a lot of language that relies on certain metaphors of DNA, like instructions or blueprint and that sort of thing. So, there have always been metaphors for the inheritance of traits. Okay, this happens to be one from the Middle Ages right up sort of into the 18th, maybe even for some people into the 19th century. Right at the beginning, after they discovered sperm through the microscope, they thought they could see these little humans inside of the head of the sperm, and that they thought that it was a homunculus. And a homunculus is basically like a tiny, unformed human being. It's almost like, the blank template of a human being was the idea. And that this homunculus would make its way into the uterus and would just grow there. That was sort of the common understanding of reproduction for quite a long time in the West. But again, it was also kind of a metaphor, it was some people kind of believed it, but also understood maybe there was something else going on. Nowadays, when we talk about DNA, now that we've discovered DNA, we talk about it as being the blueprint for life, as if it's something that you can, you just lay it out and do exactly what it says on the sheet of paper, and you'll end up with a human being. And that's great, except DNA doesn't exactly work that way. There are a lot of environmentally contingent factors in DNA. There are a few things that are absolutely predetermined by genes, but most things are not. The genes are the sort of substrate that the trait is built upon, but they don't necessarily define the trait completely. The same is true when we try and use the metaphor of information, that DNA stores information the way a hard disk does, right? Except instead of using zeros and ones, it has a 4-letter code of A's, T's, C's, and G's. We'll get into that in the next video. Again, it sort of works that way, but only if, like, the code could rewrite itself based on what other code is active at that moment. You see what I mean? So it's not as simple as just storing information. Same goes true for the Book of Life. Like, again, it's a book that can edit itself, and which, occasionally sort of changes randomly. as you copy the library. So it's, the metaphors don't work for everything, but they help us understand some basic aspects of the thing we're trying to understand, okay? That's the thing about metaphors and models. They're incomplete representations of a thing. They're meant to communicate and to help us think about things. They indicate some of the properties that the two things have in common. So yes, DNA is a little bit like a blueprint in some respects. That is true. It's just that it's not completely like a blueprint. And so the point of a metaphor is to highlight those similarities. There isn't a single metaphor that captures all of the complexity of DNA. And in fact, actually, we're going to be just barely scratching the surface over the next several videos of how DNA works and how you go from DNA to traits. So bear that in mind as we're talking about this. And always remember that not to mistake the metaphor for the thing itself. All right. With that said, stay tuned for the next video. We're going to talk about the basic cell anatomy that's relevant to DNA function, and why you should even care. Okay? See you soon. Take care.